How's it going, everybody? So in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about keto adaptation, and I want to really kind of discuss a little passage that I came across in a nutrition certification course I'm currently going through, and discuss why the mainstream kind of paradigm surrounding carbohydrate metabolism and fatty acid oxidation in regards to exercise performance is missing some key points. So first I want to actually say that this nutrition certification that I'm going through is pretty comprehensive, and I love how it has a heavy emphasis on evidence-based nutrition, and it has a really heavy emphasis on science and how to interpret studies. The vast majority of information in this nutrition course that I'm going through is pretty nuanced, and it does not really speak in absolutes as much as most certification courses or textbooks generally do. So I definitely appreciate the open-ended, open-minded, actual evidence-based approach that it takes, compared to making absolutist terms and kind of drawing a line in the sand of dogma. So, because not a lot of so-called evidence-based anything really does such a thing. So anyway, but there is one passage I really want to kind of get across. This is very common dogma in most evidence-based nutrition circles, but people have been kind of opening up to some of the flaws in the research recently. I made an entire video explaining some of the flaws in these ideas recently, so you want to go back a couple of videos and find it, or just leave a comment down below and I'll try to link it to you if I can find it, because YouTube search really does suck. Can't find jack shit anymore. Anyway, so let's get into this. So this is a chapter on nutrient timing and a section on carbohydrate periodization. So it says, remember from earlier, ATP synthesis from fat metabolism is too slow to supply working muscles with the energy that they need during intense exercise. Carbohydrates are the predominant fuel source for endurance activity. Ramjan et al. 1993 showed an increase in the use of carbohydrates as the intensity of exercise increased. It was also demonstrated that as exercise increased in duration, the use of carbohydrates decreased, and an increase in free fatty acids was shown. The conditions of the study are important because subjects were overnight fasted with no carbohydrates fed before or during exercise, which we know would favor the use of free fatty acids over muscle glycogen stores. Okay, so there's quite a few assumptions that they kind of project onto this that are not actually supported by the evidence and mechanisms mentioned. So, first of all, we know that overnight fasting would favor the use of free fatty acids over muscle glycogen stores. Okay, muscle glycogen stores are not magically depleted after a period of no carbohydrate feeding, okay? Anyone who's ever tried to speed up the process of keto adaptation will know, in order to burn off muscle glycogen, you can't simply just fast overnight, okay? Now, a 3-day fast can do such a thing, obviously, but an overnight fast, not really. Not on muscle glycogen. So blood glucose levels will start to go down. Liver glycogen might start to get depleted, but in order to deplete muscle glycogen stores, you have to actually contract those muscles and do some type of strenuous activity on the muscles in which you want to deplete the glycogen from. So muscle glycogen stores can only be depleted locally. It's not like, oh, I just fasted overnight, and now my muscle glycogen stores are depleted. So that's the first thing. So it doesn't surprise me that a study done on athletes that have done an overnight fast still use carbohydrates during the beginning of an endurance training routine, and then eventually they burn free fatty acids. The reason why they still had glycogen left and they're still burning glycogen is because there's two things. First of all, glycogen will restore itself after training, whether you ingest carbohydrates or not. Okay, and this is not something that the Gatorade-funded studies want you to know. And most people whose entire identity of sports science revolves around, carbohydrate loading and post-exercise window refeeding, which has been debunked. They want you to think that it's like absolutely necessary to eat carbohydrates before and after training in order to refill glycogen. But your body will refill glycogen regardless of whether you eat carbs after exercise or not after a 24-hour period. That's the first thing. The second thing is that just fasting overnight is not going to deplete glycogen stores. You have to actually engage those muscles in order to burn glycogen, unless your fast is like 2 to 3 days long or something like that. And everybody already knows that just creates an overall systemic catabolic effect in general. So, duh. But that study is not indicative of, supporting ATP synthesis being too slow from fat metabolism. That just shows your body will preferentially burn off glucose substrates first and then fatty acids, as long as there is, the athlete has been eating a relatively high carbohydrate diet. Okay. So then, after this, it goes on. After this was discovered, other studies, including one seminal study by Goedeke et al., 1999, that's spelled Goedecke, 1999, investigated the use of training with low glycogen ingestion or a high-fat diet. Okay, so first of all, what the hell do they mean they investigated the use of training with low glycogen ingestion? Okay, to my knowledge, most people do not directly ingest glycogen. Okay, the only case in which you would ingest glycogen is if you were to eat like raw meat or raw liver that's been freshly killed from an animal. Because actually ingesting glycogen means you're ingesting like glycogen itself from like muscle tissue. And that generally degrades over time after an animal is slaughtered. So I think this is a typo. I think what they're trying to say is they investigated the use of training with low glucose ingestion. Okay. Or a high-fat diet in an effort to increase free fatty oxidation and spare muscle glycogen to delay the onset of fatigue. Okay. In this study, the metabolic adaptations were measured in 16 endurance-trained athletes after 15 days. Okay, that's about the time that it takes for your body to start to begin making the full adaptations to utilizing fatty acid substrates to fuel exercise, but only the beginning. Measurements were taken in 16 endurance-trained athletes after 15 days of a high-fat diet. 69% of energy from fat, compared to a control group. 30% of calories from fat. And this study was equated for calories. Okay, so 69% of energy from fat in the high-fat group. That is generally pretty close to ketogenic. That's generally seen as ketogenic at the lower end of ketogenesis. Usually it's more like 75 to 80% of energy from fat. But there's two problems with this study. The first one is that protein was not equated. At least I haven't actually looked at the source study yet, but that's actually a common flaw in these studies. Protein needs to be equated, not just calories. The second thing is this passage does not explain the amount of carbohydrates between each group. And that is the number one most important factor in regards to a high-fat diet, in regards to burning fat for fuel versus carbs. You can have 70% of calories from fat, but still be eating enough calories or still be eating enough carbohydrates that your body's still going to be burning enough carbohydrates to keep you from fully adapting to ketogenesis. The reason for that is, as Stephen Phinney's studies, and any real serious researcher that studies ketogenesis, past 4 weeks shows there's a duration-dependent response in the amount of time that an athlete is deprived of carbohydrates in the adaptations to burning fat for fuel that takes place. So that means if you're under 30 grams of carbs per day for long enough, it's the deprivation of carbohydrates that forces the body to start to become more efficient at extracting energy from fat. And that happens, okay? And I'm going to get into that here in a bit. I'm going to explain some of the studies by Stephen Phinney. So they don't even talk about the carbohydrates amount between the two groups. And let alone the protein intake, If the high fat group has a very low protein intake, they could easily be eating very close to the same amount of carbs as the low fat group. And low protein in a high fat diet is going to decrease exercise performance. Just throwing it out there. The researchers discovered in as little as 5 to 10 days, that's the very beginnings of keto adaptation, by the way, that there was a shift from carbohydrates to fat oxidation during exercise. So imagine that. Imagine that. Your body will adapt to the specific demands that are placed upon it. Can you believe that? That's crazy. So are you meaning to tell me that if I go out in the hot weather consistently for long enough, my body will start to adapt to the hot weather and make it less stressful? Are you telling me that if I squat 3 times a week for long enough, my body will start to adapt to squatting 3 times a week and make it easier? Are you meaning to tell me that if I eat a low-carb diet for long enough, my body will start to make adaptations to burn fat more efficiently? That's amazing. I never knew that the body adapts to the specific demands placed upon it. I never heard of the principle of specificity or homeostasis. I thought that the body does not adapt. The body doesn't adapt, right? If I eat a low carb diet long enough, I didn't know the body starts to burn its own body fat and adapt to the lower caloric intake. Wow. So this is just it's crazy how people don't think in terms of universal principles. They're amazed. Wow, if I eat a low carb diet for 5 to 10 days, the body will start to burn fat instead of carbs because it's run out of carbs. Whoa. It's just okay, bear with me. That's vitally important to understand what I just said. But most people, they'll just hear sarcasm and, think that my sarcasm is pointless or something. But it's really substantially groundbreaking when you look at the blinders that these people go based on. Remember, total glycogen in the body is limited compared to fat storage. Although this method showed an improvement in the body's ability to oxidize free fatty acids throughout exercise, it also showed a decrease in the body's ability to oxidize carbohydrates. This is important because without the ability to oxidize carbohydrates, the body's ability to efficiently provide ATP decreases and performance can suffer. Okay, so this is a exaggeration and a stretch from what the study actually showed to real practical outcomes, okay? Let me read this again, and then I'll explain why this isn't an accurate representation. Okay. So, the researchers discovered in as little as 5 to 10 days that there was a shift in the high-fat group from burning carbohydrates to burning more fat during exercise. Remember that total glycogen in the body is limited compared to fat storage. Although the method showed that the body improved its ability to oxidize fat throughout exercise, it also showed a decrease in the body's ability to oxidize carbs. So no, it didn't show that the body loses its ability to burn carbs as fuel. It just showed that the body adapted to burning more fat since less carbs are available. It doesn't mean that you become carbohydrate resistant. This is important because without the ability to oxidize carbs, they're purely assuming that the body lost its ability to burn carbs. The body's ability to efficiently provide ATP decreases and performance can suffer. Okay, so just because a body suddenly is burning more fat and less carbs, they are extrapolating that to mean that the body can't produce enough ATP in order to fuel exercise performance, okay? And this has been proven wrong by Stephen Finney, and I'll explain here in a second. So they're literally saying the body cannot produce ATP fast enough to support exercise performance because a study in 1993 showed that the body uses carbohydrates for the first 30 minutes of exercise, and then after you burn all those carbs, it burns fat. Okay, no, that's not what it means. And then they show after 5 to 10 days, the body burns through all its carbs and then adapts to burning fat as fuel. And now they're saying, well, because the body burns more carbs in the first 30 minutes of exercise, that means that it can't produce enough ATP from fat. That's why it burns fat last. And it's no, there's a priority at first. Okay, especially because most of these athletes have been adapted to eating a high-carb diet for most of their life. So their body has made more adaptations to burning carbohydrates as fuel, and its pathways for producing ATP from fat has been dormant for such a long time. So all that you're really showing is the training effect, the training adaptations of carbohydrate producing ATP is more efficient in carbohydrate adapted athletes. And then when you suddenly tell the body to produce more energy from fat, that it takes some time to do so. Now, if you look at any athlete who has been on a ketogenic diet for longer than 2 months, okay, so you'll see a variance, okay, and they all do it differently. But typically what you'll hear is that generally people found, there's a right way and a wrong way to do ketogenic diets. But when you do it right and you got it dialed in, you see an amazing boost of performance on low energy intake where you can fast for 24 hours. There's a professional Muay Thai fighter, Sylvie Von something, I forgot her last name, where she does alternate day fasting combined with keto, and she performs in Thailand as a Westerner. Beating some of Thailand's greatest female fighters. And sometimes she's outclassed. They're in a higher weight class than her. Okay, and of course there's a rock climber, something McDonald. I think his name is Kyle McDonald or something. I'm probably getting him mixed up with Lyle McDonald, but he's a professional rock climber who's made a 4-hour video talking about the flaws in the evidence and his own experience with doing keto wrong and doing keto right. And there's a lot of people out there that including myself, where you see at the first month it can suck, but as long as you're getting enough protein, you're getting enough salt, and especially if you're not restricting calories and you're training properly and you don't allow a placebo effect to happen, you start to see amazing benefits. Okay. Well, and maybe some people are different, whatever. But so, you know, but the research doesn't support that. As if the research really shows a high magnitude of effect of significance for any intervention, especially in the mainstream. You know, it's like, it's hilarious how little magnitude of effect most of these studies show for any intervention. Okay. So anyway, let's kind of like debunk this with some countering evidence. So Stephen Finney has done studies with Jeff Volok that's actually showed, so like the FASTER study, for example, okay? The FASTER study actually compared elite level endurance runners who were already adapted to a high-fat diet, to a low-carb diet, to elite level endurance runners that are adapted to a high-carb diet. And they did like a 2-hour endurance treadmill test where they actually did muscle biopsies, and they actually measured glycogen utilization before and after the study. And they also measured the amount of energy output. Okay? And what they showed in that study, and then so they did the 2-hour endurance test, or whatever it was. And after that, the high-fat group had a high-fat shake with no carbs, and the high-carb group had a high-carb shake. Okay? And what they showed is, I think, so after a period of 4 hours post-exercise, the high-carb group had the same amount of muscle glycogen repletion. Okay, so they measured muscle glycogen before and after training, and then again like the 4 hours later. And they burned glycogen, but they burned predominantly fatty acids. And they compared that to the glycogen repletion of the high-carb group. And what they found is, so there's a couple things they found. The first thing is they found no difference in the amount of glycogen recovery 4 hours post-exercise between the two groups, one of which was not consuming any carbohydrates at all. Okay, and of course the common response to that on the high-carb people is, well, of course they showed no difference because the low-carb group wasn't burning as much glycogen because their ability to oxidize carbohydrates is taken away. It's like, no, it's because they spare more glycogen. Because they use so much fatty acids, they don't need to use glycogen anymore. Okay? But they did actually use enough glycogen to require recovery. And the amount of glycogen that they recovered showed no statistical significance compared to the amount of glycogen that the high-carb group recovered. Okay, this is more of a percentage thing rather than the absolute amount of glycogen they recovered. Because, they low using less glycogen. Okay. The second thing that they found is in the high-fat group, those elite-level low-carb adapted endurance athletes actually were utilizing over 70% more fat than the high-carb adapted group, okay? So where the 60 to 70% of the activity was being burnt by carbohydrates, is being fueled by carbs in the high-carb group, the exact opposite was the case for the high-fat group, where they were burning 60 to 70% fat as fuel. And in the highest performing athletes, okay, in the low-carb group, they were actually burning 80 to 90% fat. Okay, the even crazier thing is Jeff Volok actually found that the highest performing fat-adapted elite-level endurance athletes, they were oxidizing fat at over double the rate of the high-carb group. Okay, so what that means is they're basically producing ATP faster. Okay, and maybe this is an extrapolation too, but this is directly measuring energy being burnt. Okay. These high-fat athletes have adapted to burning more fat per minute. It was, I believe the findings was something like 2 grams of fat per minute versus like 0.5 to 1 gram per 0.5 to 1 gram of fat per minute in the high carb group. So the high fat group was burning more than double the amount of fat per minute. Okay? That means they are probably producing more ATP. Okay? So the biggest problem with these high carb studies is they are taking studies done on carb adapted athletes, and then sometimes they'll try to adapt them for 2 weeks to a low carb group, and then they're just extrapolating evidence that we know is only true in high carb groups. Usually they'll be like, oh, look, these athletes that are adapted to a high carb diet, they fasted overnight, and then they did an endurance test where they found that they were burning carbs for the first 30 minutes of exercise, and only after an hour burn mostly fat. That means that the body can't produce ATP fast enough to fuel exercise with fat. That's wrong. That's not, or at the very least, it's not accurate. That's not the same thing for athletes that have adapted to burning fat as fuel. This is why you only see performance decrements that are clinically significant in keto studies done on athletes that have not been training on a low-carb diet for longer than 3 weeks, okay? But then when you see the studies done by Stephen Finney, Jeff Follock, and then Ryan Laurie, God forbid I mention his name, they do studies on long-term adaptation, and they see almost always after 6 weeks on a keto diet, you see decreases in overall body weight and increases in performance, or at least they maintain their previous performance at a substantially lower body weight. So, and the thing is, it's very common for these high carb dogma gurus to claim, well, the reason why some studies show, some studies show like improvements and some studies don't, is because study design and cherry picking, and they freaking hijacked the data, they cheated the data. It's like, no, actually they studied the topic within the context of what we know about ketogenic metabolism. This is the thing. You see people in the real world that are doing crazy shit that's completely opposite to the scientific consensus, and you need to make studies based on what you see in real world experience first, and then repeat the data. Versus, like, oh, we see all these people suffering when they remove carbs for 2 weeks. And let's do some studies on people who do low carb diets for 2 weeks. How about you do low carb diets for 6 weeks, right? So it makes sense in the sense that, there's this idea of hormesis, where the body can basically adapt to various environmental stressors as long as the stressor is moderate enough to where it doesn't damage the system. The second thing is we see if you do endurance type training for long enough, your body makes physical adaptations to endurance training. How long does it usually take for the body? And then the same thing for strength training. You take an untrained lifter and then you put them through sets of 4 to 5 reps or whatever for a period of 5 weeks. They'll be sore as fuck for that first month, but they'll make adaptations. How long does it usually take for the soreness to go away, for the repeated bout effect to kick in? About 4 to 5 weeks, generally speaking. That's why block periodization phases usually last 4 to 5 weeks with a deload period, because that's how long it takes for the body to adapt to the stimulus, and then they try to keep refreshing the stimulus over time. Generally speaking, we're talking energy systems. We're talking making adaptations to specific energy substrates. We know endurance adaptations, depending on the diet you follow, generally though, it'll burn carbs, but it'll burn more fat than a strength training program, supposedly. Okay? And mind you, most of these studies are done on high carb diet people usually, relative to the low carb group, but they usually don't control for diet, so we don't know. We don't even know about that. But the point is how you train. If you train endurance, you make adaptations that make you more efficient at burning fat, regardless of your diet. You'll burn more fat over time doing endurance training. That's why most of the fat adaptation studies are done on endurance athletes, because it's the preconceived belief that endurance training burns more fat. We know the more that we train in, strength training and bodybuilding type stuff and the, 5 to 12 rep range, where body becomes more efficient at anaerobic metabolism, like glycolysis and burning more carbohydrate substrates. So just training physically can change your body's physical adaptations to different substrates, and it takes about 4 to 5 weeks to do so. Yet we expect the body to just magically adapt in 5 to 10 days on that one study. 5 to 10 days. And they didn't even talk about performance outcomes in that study. They just said, oh, yeah, your body seems to burn more fat and less carbs, therefore it's probably making less ATP. Nope, studies done after, freaking 4 to 5 weeks show that your body becomes more, able to adapt. So more efficient at burning fat. So yeah. It's not that keto is God or something. It's just that the science and understanding of these things is missing a lot of points. Mostly because people are looking at this through a lens of keto people are pseudoscience, keto people are charlatans and this and that. And obviously people like Dr. Berg don't make it any better. They basically give keto a bad name with their because they do come with a lot of nonsense that is just, don't even get me started. But that doesn't mean that keto in general is, these keto charlatans, these keto zealots. Stop with the name calling, you freaking elementary school student. There are things people are missing because they're looking at things through this dogmatic lens. That's all I'm saying. Keto's not necessarily superior, I guess. I believe that it gives you some distinct advantages. Who wouldn't want access to the 40 to 80,000 calories worth of body fat as fuel that is accessible regardless of your food intake, when you're keto adapted? Some people say keto adaptation's a myth, it's crazy. Man, that gelatin protein really did fluff up my coffee. It's like a giant block of foam. Anyway, one more thing that I'll remind you all is that the body can refill glycogen from other substrates besides exogenous carbs. The glycerol backbone of triglycerides, okay, that can actually be, that whole process of creating glucose from glycerol can be upregulated over time, provided there is a specific demand for it. If your demand to create glucose and glycogen from fat is upregulated, is increased through the deprivation of carbs, you will start to produce more glucose and glycogen from glycerol. And that's probably why ketogenic athletes in the FASTER study were able to refill glycogen with the same clinical or the same statistical significance. Okay? They do spare glycogen, but they still burnt glycogen and refilled it with the same percentage. What else? The Cori cycle. You can produce glucose from lactate, pyruvate. What else? There's this mystery of fat droplets. We know that fat droplets seem to maybe supply energy to working muscles locally. We just don't know to what degree. And these might take the place of glucose or of glycogen to some degree. So yeah, and I know that there's various other, like amino acids like alanine. Typically the body doesn't catabolize protein in low carb diets unless you're under eating protein and calorically restricted, which is the same thing for calorically restricted diets that don't eat enough protein. Your body's going to produce glucose from muscle tissue no matter what carbohydrate amount you're following if you're not eating enough protein. So in low-carb diets, if you're not eating enough protein, you'll see performance decreases, okay? Especially if it's a low-calorie diet, okay? So study design and the context, like how long these people have adapted, and sodium supplementation matters in keto-adapted athletes. And lean mass losses can happen in keto-adapted athletes that are wasting water if they don't refill it with salt. So anyway, leave your question and comments down below. I just had to make a video about this. High carb zealots. Let's put like I've been doing periods of high carb, experimentation on my athletic performance for a while. My last competition, I was eating like 200 grams of carbs or more per day. But I've also competed in Muay Thai on a zero carb carnivore diet. So I've done experiments and I found like more fatigue actually when I eat a high carb diet, because I guess I'm sensitive. I don't know, but I do way better on keto. So like on a ketogenic metabolism. Anyway, let me know what y'all think. If you're going to debunk me, address me point by point. Don't just say, oh, you're full of crap. Or don't just leave a comment, keto zealot or something. Leave a comment and make it valuable. Bring meaning to it, please. Okay? It makes no sense to leave a comment where you just talk crap. Okay? I want studies. I want you to explain why I'm wrong so I can evolve my own understanding. Because I'm open to the possibility that I'm wrong. That's the only reason I did that high carb experiment earlier in 2021 and competed on a higher carb diet. Leave a question, comments down below. Talk to you all next time.